Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while still supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. Check us out on Twitch every Wednesday evening for great games of CEDH with special guests every week. If you sub to our Twitch, you get additional perks, such as access to our Discord. We will be going to SEGCon Indianapolis this coming March. We will be playing CEDH in the Command Zone and recording games while we are there. Stop by and say hello, and let's jam some games together. We will also be going to Marchesa 2022 tournament in March. Marchesa is a 2-day Magic the Gathering tournament series featuring over $2,000 in prizes. It will have CEDH, Legacy, and Conquest. Check the links in the description below for more information. We hope to see you there. Now let's start off by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Zach piloting Mono Red Burn. This deck aims to attack using cheap, efficient creatures paired with burn spells to kill their opponents. Zach's opening hand contains a Fire Blast, Exquisite Firecraft, 2 Goblin Guides, and 3 Mountains. Next, we have Mike piloting Urion, Death and Taxes. This is a toolbox deck that uses Recruiter of the Guard and Stoneforge Mystic to tutor up Silver Bullet cards to interact and overwhelm their opponent. Mike's opening hand contains a Basic Plains, Wasteland, Solitude, Spirit of the Labyrinth, Recruiter of the Guard, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and a Mother of Runes. Without further ado, let's kick off this silly spell-slinging circus. Zach won the Interpretive Dance competition and gets to start us off. Zach plays a Mountain and casts Goblin Guide. He moves to combat and attacks Mike. Goblin Guide triggers and Mike reveals a Rishadan Port, putting it into his hand. Before damage, Mike flashes in Solitude, paying its alternative cost, exiling a Spirit of the Labyrinth. Solitude enters, exiles Goblin Guide, Zach gains 2 life, and the Solitude sacrifices itself. With nothing else, Zach passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He casts Mother of Runes. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Mountain. He casts another Goblin Guide. Zach moves to combat and attacks with Goblin Guide. Guide triggers, and Mike reveals a Stoneforge Mystic, leaving it on top of his library. Mike takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Lava Spike, dealing 3 to Mike. Zach ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Rishadan Port. He casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Mike passes. Zach draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Monastery Swiftspear. Being stonewalled by Thalia and Mother of Runes, Zach passes the turn. Mike draws and starts off by casting Stoneforge Mystic. It enters and Mike searches up a Batterskull into his hand. He plays a Wasteland. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and passes. Mike draws and plays a Rishadan Port. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts a Goblin Guide. With no good attacks, Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike activates Stoneforge, putting Batterskull into play. Oof. It enters and attaches to a 0/0 Germ token. Mike draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks with Batterskull. In a desperation attempt, Zach sacrifices 2 Mountains to cast Fire Blast, targeting the Germ token. In response, Mike activates Mother of Runes, targeting his Germ token. With no good way to deal with Batterskull, Zach concedes the game. Before moving to game 2, Zach moves to sideboard. He takes out 3 Exquisite Firecraft and brings in 3 Shattering Spree to better deal with Mike's artifacts. Mike has no sideboard changes. In this game, Zach's opening hand contains a Fire Blast, Chain Lightning, 2 Lava Spikes, Monastery Swiftspear, and 2 Mountains. In this game, Mike's opening hand contains 2 Plains, Aether Vial, Stoneforge Mystic, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Swords to Plowshares, and a Spirit of the Labyrinth. And Zach gets to start us off. Zach plays a Mountain and casts Monastery Swiftspear. He moves to combat and attacks Mike for 1. Mike takes it, and Zach ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He casts an Aether Vial. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Lava Spike, targeting Mike. Swiftspear triggers and gets +1/+1 until end of turn. He casts another Lava Spike, dealing 3 more to Mike, and Swift Spear gets another +1/+1 until end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Swift Spear. Mike takes it, and Zack gives the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike adds a charge counter to Aether Vial. He draws and plays a Plains. He casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. He ends his turn. Zack draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Chain Lightning targeting Thalia. Swift Spear triggers and gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Thalia dies and Zack moves to combat, attacking with the Swift Spear. Mike takes it and Zack passes. During his upkeep, Mike puts a charge counter on Aether Vial. He draws and plays a Wasteland. Mike casts Skyclave Apparition. It enters and exiles Monastery Swift Spear. Mike passes to Zack. Zack draws and casts Eidolon of the Great Revel. He ships the turn. At the end of Zack's turn, Mike activates Aether Vial, putting Stoneforge Mystic into play. Stoneforge triggers, and Mike fetches up a Batterskull into his hand. During his upkeep, Mike puts a charge counter onto Aether Vial. He draws and passes. Zack draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Roiling Vortex. Eidolon triggers, dealing 2 to Zack. Zack ends the turn. At the end of Zack's turn, Mike activates Stoneforge, putting Batterskull into play. It enters and attaches to a 0/0 Germ token. Still in the end step, Mike activates Aether Vial, putting Mangara of Korondor into play. Still in the end step, Zack sacrifices 2 mountains to cast Fire Blast targeting Mangara. Roiling Vortex triggers and deals 5 to Zack. Fire Blast kills Mangara, and the turn finally moves to Mike. During his upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 to Mike. He draws and plays Caracas. Mike moves to combat and attacks with the Germ token. Before damage, Zack activates Rolling Vortex, shutting off life gain for the turn. Zack takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike pays 3 mana to put Urion into his hand. Mike gives the turn to Zack. During his upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 to Zack. He draws and passes. During his upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 to Mike. He draws and moves straight to combat. Mike attacks with the Germ token and Skyclave Apparition. Before damage, Zack activates Rolling Vortex, shutting off life gain for the turn. Zack declares no blocks and takes the hit. In his second main phase, Mike floats mana from his Caracas, then plays another Caracas, sacrificing the tapped one. He casts Urion. It enters and triggers, targeting Skyclave Apparition and Stoneforge Mystic. They both exile, and Skyclave triggers, giving Zack a 1/1 blue illusion token. Mike moves to his end step, and both Skyclave and Stoneforge enter the battlefield. Both trigger, Skyclave exiles Roiling Vortex, and Mike tutors Cauldra Compleat into his hand. Then the turn moves to Zack. Zack draws and plays a Mountain. He passes. Mike draws and starts off by activating Stoneforge Mystic, putting Cauldra Compleat into play. It enters and attaches to a 0/0 Germ token. Mike moves to combat and attacks with Urion and both Germ tokens. Zack can't do anything about the attacks and dies. After a swift 2-0 from Mike, he and Zack decide to run it back and play another match. In this game, Mike's opening hand contains a Plains, Wasteland, Stoneforge Mystic, Spirit of the Labyrinth, Mangara of Korondor, Flicker Wisp, and a Swords to Plowshares. In this game, Zack's opening hand contains a Rolling Vortex, 2 Eidolon of the Great Revel, Chain Lightning, Lightning Bolt, Monastery Swift Spear, and a Barbarian Ring. And Mike gets to start us off. Mike plays a Plains and passes. Zack draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Monastery Swift Spear. He moves to combat and attacks with the Swift Spear. Before damage, Mike casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Swift Spear, gaining Zack 1 life. Zack ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Wasteland. He casts Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and Mike tutors up Batterskull into his hand. He ships the turn. Zack draws and plays a Barbarian Ring. He casts Monastery Swift Spear. Zack taps his Barb Ring to cast Chain Lightning, targeting Stoneforge Mystic. Swift Spear triggers and gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Stoneforge dies, and Zack moves to combat. He attacks with the Swift Spear. Mike takes it, and Zack passes. Mike draws and casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. He gives the turn to Zack. Zack draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Spirit of the Labyrinth. Swift Spear triggers, getting +1/+1 until end of turn. Bolt resolves, and Spirit dies. Zack moves to combat and attacks Mike with the Swift Spear. Mike takes it, and in his second main phase, Zack taps Barb Ring to cast Eidolon of the Great Revel. Zach ends his turn. Mike draws and casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. Eidolon triggers and deals 2 to Mike. He ends his turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting Lava Spike, targeting Mike. Swift Spear triggers, getting +1/+1. Eidolon triggers, dealing 2 to Zach. Zach then moves to combat and attacks with the Swift Spear. Mike blocks with the Spirit and they both die. In a second main phase, Zach taps Barb Ring to cast another Eidolon of the Great Revel. Eidolon triggers, dealing 2 to Zach. All finished, he passes to Mike. Mike draws, missing the land drop again, and with nothing to cast, he concedes the game to Zach. Before moving to game 2, Zach moves to sideboard. He takes out 3 Exquisite Firecraft and brings in 3 Shattering Spree to better deal with Mike's artifacts. Mike has no sideboard changes. In this game, Mike's opening hand contains Wasteland, 2 Plains, a Rashadan Port, Recruiter of the Guard, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and a Stoneforge Mystic. In this game, Zach's opening hand contains a Fire Blast, Lightning Bolt, Lava Spike, Eidolon of the Great Revel, 2 Monastery Swift Spears, and a Mountain. And Mike gets to start us off. Mike plays a Plains. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Monastery Swift Spear. He moves to combat and attacks Mike for 1. Zach passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and casts another Swift Spear. He gives the turn back to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Rashadan Port. He casts Mother of Runes. He ends his turn. During Zach's upkeep, Mike ports Zach's Mountain. Zach draws and plays a Mountain. He passes. Mike draws and plays another Rashadan Port. He casts Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and Mike fetches up a Batterskull into his hand. Mike passes. During Zach's upkeep, Mike ports one of Zach's mountains. Zach draws and plays a mountain. With top decks on his side, Zach passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Wasteland. He casts another Mother of Runes. Mike ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Zach casts Lightning Bolt, dealing 3 to Mike. During Zach's upkeep, Mike ports one of his mountains. Zach draws and casts Lava Spike, targeting Mike. Both Swift Spears trigger and they get +1/+1 until end of turn. Mike takes 3 from Lava Spike and Zach gives the turn to Mike. At the end of turn, Mike activates Stoneforge, putting Batterskull into play. It enters and attaches to a 0/0 Germ token. Mike draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks with the Germ token. Zach takes it, Mike gains 4 life, and in his second main, Mike plays Karakas. He ends the turn. During Zach's upkeep, Mike ports 2 of Zach's mountains. He draws and casts Monastery Swift Spear. Zach ships the turn. Mike draws and starts off his turn by casting Recruiter of the Guard. It enters and Mike tutors for Sanctum Prelate, putting it into his hand. He casts Sanctum Prelate. Prelate enters, and Mike chooses 2, stopping all players from casting non-creature spells with mana value 2. Mike moves to combat and attacks with the Germ. Zach takes it and Mike gains 4 life. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting his 4th Monastery Swift Spear. He follows up with a Shattering Spree, targeting the Batterskull. All 4 Swift Spears trigger, getting +1/+1 until the end of turn. Batterskull is destroyed and Zach moves to combat. He attacks with all 4 Swift Spears. Mike blocks 2 Swift Spears with each of his Mother of Runes. Before damage, he activates both Mother of Runes, giving themselves protection from red until end of turn. Mike takes the rest and Zach passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He moves to combat and attacks with Stoneforge Mystic. Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Flicker Wisp. It enters and exiles Stoneforge Mystic. Mike moves to his end step. Stoneforge enters and triggers. Mike tutors Cauldron Compleat into his hand. All finished up, he gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, Mike ports one of Zach's mountains. In response, Zach floats a red mana. Still in his upkeep, Zach casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Mike. All 4 Swift Spears trigger and get +1/+1 until end of turn. Mike takes 3 from the bolt, and still in his upkeep, Mike ports Zach's final mountain. Zach draws, takes no more game actions, and passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He activates Stoneforge, putting Cauldron Compleat into play, attaching it to a 0/0 Germ token. Mike moves to combat and attacks with the Germ token. Zach declares no blocks and takes the hit. In his second main phase, Mike casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. He gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, Mike ports 2 of Zach's mountains. Zach draws and with the writing on the wall and no castable spells in hand, Zach concedes the game. Both players don't have any sideboard actions. In this game, Zach's opening hand contains a Fire Blast, 3 Lava Spikes, Shattering Spree, and 2 Mountains. In this game, Mike's opening hand contains a Wasteland, Plains, 2 Swords to Plowshares, Stoneforge Mystic, Sword of Fire and Ice, and a Spirit of the Labyrinth. And Zach gets to start us off. Zach plays Mountain and casts Lava Spike, dealing 3 to Mike. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He ships the turn. Zach draws and plays Mountain. He casts Lava Spike, dealing 3 to Mike. He casts another Lava Spike, dealing 3 more to Mike. With Mike really feeling the burn, Zach passes. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He casts Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and Mike tutors a Batterskull into his hand. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Eidolon of the Great Revel. He passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He ends the turn. Zach draws and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike activates Stoneforge Mystic, putting Batterskull into play attached to a 0/0 Germ token. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with the Germ token. Zach takes it, and Mike gains 4 life. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and starts off by casting Shattering Spree, targeting Batterskull. Eidolon triggers, dealing 2 to Zach. In response, Mike activates Batterskull, bouncing it back to his hand. Zach moves to combat and attacks with Eidolon. Mike declares no blocks, and before damage, Mike casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Eidolon. Eidolon triggers, dealing 2 to Mike. Eidolon is then exiled, and Zach gains 2 life. All finished, Zach passes. Mike draws and plays a Plains. He casts Mother of Runes. He casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. Mike passes. Zach draws and casts Riftbolt, killing Mother of Runes. He ends the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike activates Stoneforge, putting Batterskull into play attached to a 0/0 Germ token. Mike draws and plays a Wasteland. He activates Stoneforge, putting a Sword of Fire and Ice into play. He equips the sword to Batterskull. He casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Mike moves to combat and attacks with the Germ token and Spirit of the Labyrinth. Zach takes the hit. Mike gains 6 life, and Sword of Fire and Ice triggers. Mike doesn't draw due to Spirit of the Labyrinth and deals 2 damage to Zach. With a dominating board state, Mike passes. Zach draws, has no outs, and concedes the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what an exciting couple of matches. Congrats to Mike on both of his victories tonight. In both matches, Mike used his interaction to slow Zach down and give him enough time to go over the top of Zach's strategy with difficult to deal with threats. These matches felt like an uphill battle for Zach. Mike did a great job of denying Zach of his resources and not giving him any wiggle room to fight back effectively. The most valuable card in tonight's matches goes to Stoneforge Mystic. Not only did this card allow Mike to find the extremely difficult to interact with Batterskull, but it also allowed him to cheat it into play while being a blocker for Zach's creatures. This card was basically a 1-card win con against Zach's deck, and Mike showed off every bit of its power tonight. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will win the next Legacy match. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.